May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Kook Audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Kook Audio, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Doghead Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. Today we will have another episode from Tassajara Stories, a work in progress. And I'm going to read two pieces today. I haven't looked at them in a long time. I don't know how long. Months, half a year. But before we get going, let's have pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause. Meditate for as long as you wish. And when you're through, hit unpause. Then we'll hit the bell to end meditation, or whatever you were doing, or not doing. And we'll welcome you back, and then we will get into the business of the day. So here's a piece called Shopping. It seems curious to me now that I went down to LA the few times I did on these shopping and research trips. That wasn't repeated or necessary after that, but there was just so little happening in the organic and natural food field. Fred Rohe's small yet prototypical New Age natural foods in the Sunset section of San Francisco was the best, or maybe the only such store. He was a lot of help in terms of how to get good food. Mainly, he said to buy local, grow as much as you're able, and use as few packages and cans as you can. He suggested Coda Brothers, organic brown rice in Dos Palos. And he mentioned a few places down south. One was Organicville in L.A. In the spring of 1966, I went there, sought advice from the owner. He had a lot to say, mainly about how the health food world was full of crooks and junk. From the second-story deck outside his office, overlooking the store below, with a sweeping gesture, he made disparaging comments about what people were buying. It's 90% crap down there. Supplements, vitamins, packaged snake oil. His large store had little more produce than Rohe's small one. I told him I'd been to Hain, the company that made cold-pressed oils that health food stores were buying. Mr. Organicville said, cold-pressed doesn't mean what people think. It still gets up to 120. I told him the stocky man I'd met in the office there smoked a cigar and wouldn't let me look around. The Organicville owners said that's because he didn't want you to see the pigs they were slaughtering in back to make their margarine. I laughed. Actually, he said, that would be better than the hydrogenated oils they use, and that all margarine uses. Better to eat butter, he said. I couldn't convince anyone at Tassajara that there was a problem with hydrogenated oils, and I didn't really know for sure myself. We were torn between wanting to make healthy food choices and not wanting to succumb to food fanaticism, which some of us were plagued by. We did not have a high fat of any kind diet, so we kept using margarine with bread. Hain margarine, which we bought, must be at least a little healthier because it was just partially hydrogenated, but a lot of us just used a mix of sesame butter with miso called muso. Finally, margarine did get the boot from the Tassajara kitchen, and the Food and Drug Administration came down heavy on partially hydrogenated oil, which by then was called trans fat. Another clash over synthetics came about due to the housefly situation. We had lots of flies in the first years. There was much more animal food then, including some meat and fish served the guests, and the remnants of it ended up in the compost. There was chicken and horse manure for the gardens. It took time for us to learn not to breed flies through carelessness. Compost and manure had to be well covered with dirt or tarps or screened in. I ordered 20 fly traps, quart jars with tops that allowed flies to enter but not leave. I'd put something like chicken scraps in them and set them out near the garden and compost and around, but not where people would be because they were gross-looking and foul-smelling. In 5 or so days, they'd be full of dead flies, which I'd bury, though now I think I should have composted. Really disgusting work. Not exhilarating like the fly herding we did in the dining room. One day, I walked into the kitchen, and there were a bunch of yellow strips hanging up. They'd been using fly strips, but these weren't sticky strips that trapped them. They were hard, rectangular plastic. I asked what they were and learned they were shell fly strips. It wasn't long before almost all the flies in the kitchen had died. I found that alarming and said they should be removed immediately. Why? Because they created an environment that's lethal to something as big as a fly. You want to work in an environment like that? What's it going to do to you and the food? The answer I got from the person in charge that day was that if the shell company put them out, then they must be okay. We can trust them. If I'd had any hair, I'd have started pulling it out. I ranted about it in the kitchen. I ranted about it to staff. No one wanted to take sides. Fortunately, Sterling Bennell came to visit. I took him in the kitchen. Oh, them, he said. He identified the active ingredient as dichloros and said it was the same as what was used in the purple strips earlier in the century. He called it a neurotoxin. He said it was very popular and was blamed for an increase in leukemia. He explained how it mimics just what cancer does, or something like that. Said it would take years to determine just how dangerous they were, but he wouldn't hang out near them. I went around quoting him. One morning they weren't there, and no one suggested they be replaced. In 1971, 5 years after they'd come out, the federal government had the shell company put a warning on them not to use them in hospitals, nurseries, kitchens, or restaurants. Then the EPA reported they brought a high cancer risk. Shell turned to Mexico and other foreign countries where their strips became popular and included suggestions to use them in kitchens, bedrooms, and above baby cribs. Okay, now you notice I mentioned herding flies in the dining room. We also did that in the Zendo. I'd forgotten that, but somebody brought that up recently. And the reason I didn't get into that then was I mentioned it somewhere else in a piece on the dining room or something. Yeah. And reading these vignettes, it's just parts that have got to be worked on and put together. And there's a lot of work here. And, the only way it's going to happen is if I concentrate on it. So, I'm thinking, well, I got to get this out of the way and that out of the way. And then I'll get to it. Because really, something like that, it's not going to happen unless I really concentrate on it. But at least if I never get to that, we'll have the pieces read, these pieces that would evolve beyond this, of course. So, all right, here's the final piece for today's reading. It's called Notables. The boot camp of the first practice period behind us, slightly more sober, we entered the stage of Guest Season 1, Act 2. Guests now ate in the brighter new dining room, the old clubhouse with the dorm on top built in the prior century. There were hand-hewn beams across the ceiling and a good-sized deck adjoining, with the view down to the little creek meeting Tassajara Creek. People might eat at a table out there or meet. Inside there was sunlight through the windows on 3 sides and electric lights behind fogged glass in the ceiling for the evening. If a generator wasn't running to power the lights, I'd dart to the shop and crank one up. I'd never before dealt with an engine that started with a hand crank. When I was shown how to do it, I was told not to grip the crank all the way around using the thumb, so that if it kicks, it will shoot out of my hand and won't break my wrist. Otherwise, the generators only ran long enough to get the walk-in cool. It was good to have 2 of them because those old codgers broke down now and then. They weren't complicated, so a new arrival named Clark Mason could fix them pretty quick. Then one evening, both generators had parts on the floor, Clark all greasy working into the evening, so we brought out the kerosene lamps. The guests liked the cozy feeling sitting with the lamps illuminating just enough. Everyone in camp enjoyed the silence, so no more grumble, grumble, clankety-clank penetrating the gentle evening. There was an education to be had absorbing the news and the olds brought by the visitors. That was a time of beginnings and renewals, not just for us, but the whole of society, and some of the folks who were thus forging ahead came to sniff us out. Met a blonde fella who told me about a book he was working on, a catalog which would feature tools for the emerging counterculture and anyone else who might benefit. He had a broad definition of tools. Books were included, clothes, whatever would help people do things themselves, live lightly on the land. He showed me a photo of the Earth from space and said that NASA had put it together from many smaller images. His name was Stuart Brand. Turned out he was maybe responsible for NASA doing that, as he'd fostered a campaign for just that purpose. He stood in the Commons of UC Berkeley with a sign reading something like, "Show us the whole Earth." Then there was an engaging man named Dick Raymond. He was excited about all sorts of new stuff. He had a group named the Portola Institute. He wanted to see school kids get into computers and what he called simulated games. I understood neither, but I liked his enthusiasm. One of the projects of the Institute was a book of sorts. Soon I realized it was the book that Brand had talked about, the one that became the Whole Earth Catalog. When it came out the next year, Tassajara got an ecology award for our ceremonial oryoki practice, wherein washing the bowls is part of the ceremony, and the water collected in buckets from that washing toward the end of the ceremony is offered to the garden. Raymond and Brand had both used the word ecology and were not interested in doing anything that was not harmonious with nature. I'd heard that word earlier in the year from Yvonne's friend Sterling Bennell. I gathered from him that ecology was a science which saw all life as interconnected and the physical environment as interconnected with all life. And, at least for him, it all interconnected with the whole universe. To Bennell, nature was everything. And then he'd bring in physics and say it all gets down not to tiny things, but to tiny events. There was no subject he couldn't speak on and tie into everything else: science, literature, politics, aliens, psychic phenomena, falcons. He'd written an article for the Scientific American on the pupfish in Death Valley. I'd seen them swimming in Salt Creek too, but all I got out of it was, hey, look, there's fish in there. To Bennell, they had a lot to say. He'd written an article on psychedelics for the same esteemed publication in 1964 called The Hallucinogenic Drugs. He'd taken many psychedelics I'd never heard of, such as one from South America called ayahuasca. He was the culprit who guided Alan Watts on his first LSD experience. Watts was so enthusiastic about the benefits of that substance that he wrote about it and shared it with friends and colleagues. Got to know Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. Watts took a bunch of LSD to Japan, where he visited with Gary Snyder and other Western Buddhists, Japanese hippies, and open-minded intellectuals. By the time I met Bennell, psychedelics was just an aside. His passions were nature and mind, individual mind, interconnected mind, and big mind, just like Shunryu Suzuki spoke of. To both of them, nature and big mind were one and the same. And Bennell said that's how Einstein saw it too. Poet Michael McClure did a couple of readings at Tassajara that summer from the Love Lion book, among others. He just come out with a book called Freewheeling Frank about Frank Reynolds, the secretary of the San Francisco Hells Angels. He said that Reynolds had a serious interest in Zen. We went for a walk down to the Narrows, and on the way he introduced me to Yerba Santa, the holy herb, told me that California Indians made a tea out of it. if they had a cold or cough. He took a tiny top leaf and gave me one, telling me how to chew on it some and keep it in my mouth. A little later, when I took a sip of water from the creek, a delicate sweetness followed. McClure had come to California from Kansas with Dave Hazelwood, who'd sat at Sokoji with Suzuki in the early 60s and whose upscale Arawan Press published McClure's second book and was the first to publish Philip Whalen and other notable Bay Area bards. McClure and Hazelwood had teamed up with Sterling Bennell and early Sokoji sitter-poet Joanne Kiger for walks in the woods and wild of the Bay Area. Poets galore came down the road. They'd sat at Sokoji or were familiar with the Zen Center or knew Richard Baker from the poetry conference he'd organized for UC Berkeley 2 years before. I felt like I was experiencing an extended family, including distant cousins. I recognized poet Richard Brodigan with his handlebar mustache and wide brim hat, walking on the road above the courtyard. His novel, Trout Fishing in America, had come out that year and had circulated through the cabins. The biggest deal was when Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Daniel Moore came in. They meditated in the Zendo, walked to the Narrows, and in the evening read their poetry, sang and chanted mantras with students joining him. Ginsberg played his harmonium with Ferlinghetti and Moore on Chinese horn and Hindu bells. Ginsberg sang the melodic rendition of the Heart Sutra he'd first tried out with Suzuki years before. Moore had been a serious student of Suzuki's a few years back. The year before, he'd founded the outrageous Floating Lotus Magic Opera Company. Moore said that once on his way to morning zazen in the rubble of some street work, he spotted an interesting piece of asphalt with tar paper stuck to it that bore what looked like kanji. After meditation, he showed it to Suzuki. He looked at it for a moment, then his eyes crinkled. He waved his finger above it, forming the same looping characters in the air. "Yes, it says 60, he said, the number 60, and today is my 60th birthday. Then happy birthday to you," Moore said, happily bowed and went on his way. Daniel said there had been a party in Oakland for Zen Center folks at a nice home with a pool. Suzuki was standing with his back to the pool, talking with some people, and Daniel started tripping on how easy it would be to push him in and what a moment it would be for future annals of Zen. "I stood there with these powerful thoughts," he said, "pounding through me, but made no moves, and after a short time failed to act on them, losing the utter spontaneity and finally quelled them completely. At that moment I heard Suzuki remark with amusement, without looking at me, he was going to throw me into the swimming pool." Daniel later wrote, "Although I don't claim to have really known a hornet stinger about what Zen was really all about, attending the lectures and listening to Sensei Suzuki explain in his then very halting but always expressive English, with his long pauses, his sweet moonlight face, with its plain but sunny expression, and the general feeling that we were all in on a great secret, made it seem that Zen was really possible in San Francisco." Writer Peter Matheson and his wife, writer Deborah Love, came as students and stayed a while. He'd been practicing with Tai-san at New York Zen Studies and had done sesshin with Nakagawa Soen and Yasutani. He called Shunryu Suzuki the most widely revered Zen teacher in the country. He'd been a co-founder of the Paris Review and was another environmentalist. It seemed to me back then that almost everyone was becoming an environmentalist and that the whole world was on the way to being enlightened. Writer Herb Gold arrived at Tassajara in a Jaguar sedan. It had some trouble, so he generously gave it to the Zen Center and got a ride out. It was traded in for a 6-ton Dodge flatbed. Before the next guest season, Gold wrote an article on the best places to take a date in the Bay Area for the San Francisco travel section and included Tassajara. That earned him a note of reprimand from Yvonne. Melissa and Charles Levitsky came from Big Sur and their well-worn 2-story redwood cabin home. She had a greenhouse with orchids and succulents. I watched a family of raccoons enter their kitchen to politely eat dinner and leave in the evening. I wondered if we could have a more cordial relationship with the raccoons that haunted our kitchen area at night, and recalled the dominant male of the group turning toward me and pausing as I chased them out and across the low summer creek, as if to say, "Watch it, Buster. This is our territory." The Levitskys lived a short walk from Bill and Lolly Fawcett's cliffside Mediterranean menu Nepenthe restaurant, where they ran a gift shop. She had been a ballet dancer who'd toured Japan in the 30s and hated the position she'd seen for women there, had no interest in going back or in anything Japanese. But she liked us, which was good because they'd been coming to Tassajara for many years, and we didn't want to spoil it for them. It took them an hour and a half to go the 10 miles as the crow flies. Big Sur to Carmel, through Carmel Valley to Jamesburg to Tassajara. Highway 1 used to be even windier and narrower, she said, and Tassajara further away, especially before the oft-photographed Bigsby Canyon Bridge opened in 1932. Charlie leaned over and added, "In the winter, there used to be about a car a week go by." Wow. Melissa and Charlie were at Tassajara when Lou Harrison, composer in residence at San Jose State University, arrived with an entourage of fellow musicians and gave us a concert of classical Chinese music. I visited their place in the Santa Cruz Mountains with a structure just for musical instruments. It had an extra high ceiling to accommodate an instrument for their gamelan orchestra. I think he could play anything. His taste in music was unrestricted. Lou appreciated the music of Tassajara with its meditative spaces between the sounds of the Han and bells chanting from the Zendo. Melissa said she used to hire him to play piano for her when she practiced ballet, and that he'd read a book while he played. She knew avant-garde musician John Cage as well. I told her he was intrigued with Zen and had been around Sokoji in the past. She said, "The thing to know to understand John is that he doesn't like music." Paul Lee was a friend of Baker's, a professor of philosophy at UC Santa Cruz who'd studied with theologian Paul Tillich. Lee was and is cherubic. I can't think of him without seeing him smiling. He gave a talk about existential and mystical Christianity and how much the higher spheres of Christianity and Buddhism had in common. Lee had lent his support to our fundraising in several ways. One being a supportive quote for a fundraising brochure that went out to 30,000 recipients, in which he called what we were doing, quote, an important event in the history of religion in America, end quote, and urged support for this oldest of ventures, the establishment of a community for the cultivation of the spirit. About Suzuki, Lee wrote, he was a man of great strength, forceful yet gentle, and unassuming, utterly at ease. I have a strong memory of Roshi sitting on a step at Tassajara and just being there in the fullness of his presence. He was always in jolly good spirits with irrepressible good humor, although the sober seriousness of his nature was evident amidst the sunny disposition. Lee came another time and brought with him a master gardener, a Brit with the distinguished name of Alan Chadwick, who made biodynamic gardens in the tradition of Rudolf Steiner. He'd also been a Shakespearean actor, and the more one was with him, the more theater there would be. I walked up to Alan Chadwick, sunning himself by the pool, and said in greeting, "Mr. Chadwick?" "Yes," he said in a drawn-out, deep baritone, turning slowly toward me. "I'd like to introduce myself. My name is David Chadwick." He brightened and stood up. "Well, certainly then, sir, we are related." Even though Chadwick had only a year before embarked on an ambitious and already flourishing garden project at UC Santa Cruz, Baker had asked him if he might find time to help with the gardens at Tassajara. That didn't happen, except for a good deal of gardening he did that day. But his relationship with the Zen Center did not end there. Ernie Berry from the lefty hippie counterculture Berkeley Barb hitchhiked in for a few days. I always liked glancing through the irreverent Berkeley Barb. It was the first place I saw sexually oriented personals, some of which were audacious eye-openers. One that sticks with me simply read, "You name it, I'll do it." Barry met with Suzuki in his cabin and described him as a short gentleman with an air of tremendous serenity about him. Barry told me he, quote, hated the so-called Zen macrobiotic diet and tried to get Suzuki to deny any connection to Zen, but Suzuki wouldn't bite. Suzuki's answer to him about LSD, he said, left him completely bewildered by his Zen answers. The only thing clear was Suzuki's regarding LSD as completely irrelevant to anything. But Suzuki did tell him that people who've taken psychedelics are open to looking for something deeper. He said he had nothing against long hair, but he preferred shaved heads for men. Suzuki told him he was very sympathetic with young people here in America. They're tired of the civilization we now have. Barry talked to newly arrived innocent priest Kobun Chino, whom he said spoke some English haltingly and who had never heard of LSD. Barry said that for Kobun, everything American seemed irrelevant. He'd come from temples and monasteries in Japan and had almost immediately been driven to Tassajara. Barry asked Kobun what he thought of America's first actual Zen monastery. Kobun said, "The place should perhaps be called Zen Village. I sometimes call it Zen Children Village. There are almost no rules. It is a very rare type of monastery. It needs unimpeded growth, like most things young." I made a highly optimistic and questionable contribution to his article by saying, a time when we were just getting going, that Tassajara was one of the only successfully functioning utopian-type communities in the United States. Then the not-so-embarrassing Suzuki Roshi's spiritual presence provides the inner harmony to keep the community operating. I know why I'd said that utopian thing. I'd been talking with Paul Kagan, who'd come to study us briefly for a book he was writing about utopian communities. He told me that secular communities tended to last about 5 years, and spiritually oriented ones about 10 times that long. 50 years seemed like forever to me then, so that gave me confidence Tassajara would sail smoothly into the distant future. A couple of students working with me in the dining room had stopped setting up and were looking out the window and back. I walked over. "Wow," I said, "deer on that steep hillside. I wouldn't have thought deer could even go there. Indeed, I wouldn't want to climb it. Might slip and fall," one of the students said. "Sensei was looking at deer there in the same place the other day from out in the courtyard and said, 'See those deer on the hill? Your life is just like that.'" I got distracted then by a guest sticking his head in and needing some help. I didn't find out which sensei, which priest had said that. It could be Kobun or Katagiri who'd just been there. Some of the earlier students still called Suzuki sensei instead of Roshi, and I wondered, how is my life like those deer on the hill? Okay, so that was what I call notables. Yeah, I figured if I was going to drop names, just drop a whole bunch of them at once. There's some things like I know it says Peter Matheson and Deborah came in. That wasn't until, I think, a couple of years later. But I just put it in there, and if I can move it to there if something comes up where it'll fit chronologically. But if not, I just stick it there outside of time and maybe put a note in the end or a little disclaimer that sometime things are moved around or whatever. Oh, that thing about Herb Gold writing about it. Tassajara is one of the 10 best places in the Bay Area to take a date, to take a hot date probably back then. Yvonne wrote him a letter of reprimand. It says, look, Herb and I stayed in touch. Incidentally, Herb is still alive. He's in his 90s. He was a really interesting guy. He didn't drink. He loved pot. And he wrote in one book that he was proud that his grandson was smoking pot and that they would have 3 generations smoking pot there. He did not drink. And he said the whole idea that you have to be out of it or miserable or anything to write is ridiculous. He was totally against that. Herb introduced me to the St. Stupid's Parade in San Francisco. And I went to a number of them. I went to some of them with him, and I went to some of them without him. I loved them. I think the last one I went to, Wavy Gravy and I did a skit together. But I won't go into that. It's irrelevant. But anyway, Herb would always bring up that letter from Yvonne. He never forgot it. And he'd always say, yeah, and I got this letter from, I'd say, Herb, forget it. Nobody remembers that. It doesn't matter. Yeah, this thing about, there's some things really out of place here. I mean, in terms of time, but I just worked them all in there. Yeah, Melissa Levitsky saying John Cage didn't like music. Incidentally, a really neat thing, is it to read of Cage's, or was it a recording? I think it's to read. It's him talking about his experience going to D.T. Suzuki's classes on the East Coast. Cage was famous for his piece, So Many Seconds, like 65 seconds or whatever it is, 39 seconds, where the pianist just comes out and sits on the piano stool for that amount of time. He, never hits a note. So that's what he was famous for. And he did a lot of weird stuff. And that's what Melissa said. The thing to understand about John is that he didn't like music. Oh, here it is. I looked it up. 4 minutes and 33 seconds. That's the name of it. I'm going to read one more. It's very brief. It's called Liz Wolfe. Paul Lee arranged for Suzuki to go to UC Santa Cruz and give a talk in May of 1967. After the talk, a young student asked him if he'd meditate with them. He was most pleased to do so. Afterwards, Richard Baker complimented her on her suggestion. Did she have any prior experience? And she said, not much. She'd read the 3 Pillars of Zen, practiced Zazen in Pasadena at the home of a woman named Martha Rose Bode, and spent 3 weeks in a Vedanta ashram, which didn't give her the grounding she felt she needed. She had never met a real-life Zen master before, and now after feeling the peacefulness of meditating with him, she felt encouraged, drawn to him. Baker invited her to come to Tassajara. She was there for the first practice period. Tassajara was way harder than she'd expected. Rising at 4 a.m, the ordeal of Tangario. She was in her late teens, short, weighed only 100 pounds. When it was her time to be a server for meals in the zendo, the pots of gruel or soup were so heavy she hurt her back, which then was painful in zazen. She fought depression and had trouble getting to sleep. I don't know what I expected. Probably people going outside to sit and meditate as the sun went down, things like that. But she stuck with it. Liz was an honest, straightforward person. She didn't talk about Zen or have a lot of ideas about enlightenment. She just tried to follow the schedule, go to the zendo, do the work, but she felt inadequate to the task. Jack Elias remembers an exchange between her and Suzuki at a Shosan ceremony. Liz went up and was saying how she couldn't do the practice. Suzuki wrote, she said, just pick one thing to concentrate on and that will be enough. That will work. That left a really powerful impression on me, said Jack. Liz remembers another Shosan exchange with Suzuki that happened after a week-long session. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but I kept feeling like I was drifting, spreading out into the air. When it was my turn to ask my question, I couldn't stop laughing. I was terrified. I asked him something like, "Roshi, I feel like you're going to disappear, like I'm going to disappear, like everything's going to disappear. What should I do?" He told me, "You don't need to disappear if you don't want to." In the preparations for the 1970 lay ordination ceremony, Liz asked Suzuki, what if she decided she wanted to become a Christian later? Suzuki told her that was fine, as long as she felt sincere about what she was doing at the moment. Later, Liz passed Suzuki as he was going into his room, and he said to her something that she realized was his explanation of the Buddhist name she'd received from him at the lay ordination ceremony. Like moonlight in Tassajara Creek. Many people had expressed concern about Roshi's health, even though he seemed healthy then, she recalls. I asked him, "Roshi, what will we do when you leave us?" Or something close to that. My heart was beating so fast and I could feel the silence. Roshi looked at me with such love and said, "I will never leave you." And he never has. Okay. Well, very good. That's it. Thank you very much for joining us. Next week I'll read some more pieces from Tassajara Stories. But until then, this has been another Cuke Audio podcast. And I'm DC Booba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka, wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.